Hey, Terrence, can you hear me? Okay, cool.
I'm sorry,
All
my
right.
computer's acting a little crazy right now.
Yeah, shit. I'm just using my phone, so don't worry about it. So, I don't really have any notes prepared or anything like that. I'm just going to be working with basic logic and my knowledge of U.S. history. The basic premise here is that the Civil War was primarily about preserving the Union. I'm not sure to what degree you would dispute that, but I believe that any stated reason for any state leaving the Union would not be considered a valid reason by the U.S. government, whether that was for slavery or, to give a hypothetical scenario, let's say the government was massacring Jews in New York or something like that, and let's say there was a southern state or many southern states who said, you know what, we don't want to be a part of that, we don't want to be taxed to help support that Holocaust, we're going to go ahead and leave. I believe the U.S. government would in fact go to war in any case, for any stated reason of secession. Would you dispute that, or?
Yes, but that's still saying that the reason. Hold on, my computer's might be doing so, but yeah, I'll say I agree with you so far.
Okay, so like let's say the southern states decided to secede for some other reason, not related to slavery. Would you agree then that the U.S. government would probably still go to war in order to preserve the Union and prevent secession? Wait, can you hear me? Are you there? Oh shit. So can you hear me at all? All right, now I have to message him on Messenger. His computer just died. So do I restart the debate? Okay. I don't know what to do here. I'm basically just talking to myself. Yeah, so that's my basic premise. No, I'm good. Okay. So does it mean he's back? Okay. Anyways, I don't know that you can hear me or not, because I can't see or hear you. But you are talking to me on Facebook Messenger. So anyhow, yeah, that's my basic premise. I think. Oh, hey, were you able to hear me at all until just now?
Yeah,
you heard me the whole time.
I can hear you. No, I zoned out. Well, my computer like turned off, but it's back on now. But I don't want to start it again. I think that the time is still
Okay.
good. So I'll say this. Okay, so we're talking about secession, and we're talking about the Civil War, and the primary cause for the Civil War. Now, you can say, so basically the way I look at it is cause, effect, and the result of that effect. So for me, and looking at evidence, the cause is the South felt like the North was encroaching on their right to own slaves. That was the cause. The result of that was secession, or attempted secession from the Union. And then as a result of that secession, there's a civil war. But the root cause of that, going back to step one, is still slavery. And so there may be many reasons, like you brought up, but right before my computer turned out, you were talking about that any reason that a state or so would secede would be cause to go to war. But yes, that's still the root, that's still the cause for the secession. So to me, like I said, cause, effect, and the result of that effect, and it still goes back to slavery.
I think we're having comm issues. I don't know if it's your connection. Can you hear me at least?
I don't know if it's my. Yeah, I can hear
Okay,
you.
so I got the gist of what you're saying. Basically, that because slavery was the stated reason in this particular case, it was in fact the cause of the war, right?
Yes.
But for that to be true, you would have to say that if they had given any other reason, that the war would not have happened, right? Because if that is in fact the cause of the war.
Well, not necessarily, because there's overwhelming evidence that the cause for the secession was slavery. Like, I don't need to prove that there's some other that it would be possible for some other reason or anything like that. I'm just showing that this Civil War, our United States Civil War, that there's documents, you know, the documents of secession from the states that they wrote when they were seceding. All of them are overwhelmingly are say because of slavery. Like, I don't know if you ever read, because you said out of history, if you ever read the one from Mississippi, man. Now understand, I live in Louisiana, but that statement from Mississippi, that is probably the most racist thing I have ever read in my life. And I'll hit on some points on it probably later. But like I said, overwhelming evidence that the reason for this secession, which ended in the Civil War, was slavery.
Okay, so like I don't dispute that part. I agree, in fact, that the South was in fact racist and did practice slavery. That's not really related to my argument. I mean, we both essentially agree on that basic fact. What I'm saying is that it really wouldn't matter what reason they gave for secession, because the U.S. government simply will not allow any state to secede for any reason, even if Allen would.
Well, okay, so there's been talks of, like, recently there's been talks of states like California trying to secede from the Union and stuff like that. Now, as these talks about from California talking about possibly seceding, there has been no Congress or anything that has come across and said, hey, if you do that, we're going to go to war with you. No, so you can't say that, because we don't have anything else to base it off of. If there was no other time where a state tried to secede, so we can't say what could possibly be the cause, and would the United States go to war if a state try to secede for another reason. We can't say that because we don't know that, because there's only been one time that states actually seceded, and it was because of slavery.
Well, we can
and like for example, and like I said, and going back to, go ahead.
Well, we could also use our reason and rationality to say, okay, do you believe that the U.S. government would allow a state to secede for some other reason not related to slavery, or do you believe they probably would have went to war over that thing too? Like, what do you think?
You'd have to give me a specific example, but like I said, now, and I'm going off of current times where California has been talking about seceding from the Union, which they've been talking about that like, and they'll probably keep talking about it the whole time Trump is. And like I said, there's been no threats. Like, Trump hasn't threatened California or threatened anybody else. Hell, Texas is always talking about they're their own country and stuff like that. There's still no talks of going to war with them or anything like that. It's basically going under the radar. Like I said, there's nothing to base it off of except for the fact that this was slavery, this was the reason for the Civil War, and this is the reason why. I was talking to you about the Mississippi Statement of Secession, and one of the paragraphs on it was, there was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or dissolution of the Union, whose principle had been subverted to work our own ruin. So, like I said, I guess we could speculate on what could possibly happen in the future, or what could possibly happen, but I think that's kind of a little bit out of what the topic of the debate is about, which is, let me see if I can scroll up to the top without my computer freezing, but to make sure I get the title. The American Civil War was primarily about secession rather than slavery. Now, that right there is kind of, I think it's kind of a little weird, because if you ask somebody from the North, maybe you might get somebody that says it's about secession. But if you ask somebody from the South during that time period, like when you read the statements of secession from the Southern states, it is encroachment on our right to own slaves. It is slavery. There's no other reasons given in the statements of secession other than slavery, slavery, slavery. Like the one in Mississippi. You remember, like I said, I'm gonna keep hitting on this one because I just read this for the first time and it is overwhelmingly racist. But they say something like black people and their I'm sorry, the Negro and their skin, or they can work in the sun like they can work in the sun like no other race or something like that.
Is there a way I can interrupt you real quick? Because you're bringing up points. You're bringing up points that aren't actually in dispute. Like, I agree that the South, their stated reason was secession. Like, that's not something that we're actually disputing here. These are just known facts, and so that's not what the argument is about. I agree, in fact, that their stated reason was slavery. What I'm saying is that even if that wasn't their stated reason, the Civil War would have happened anyways, because the U.S., let's say, for example, hypothetically, let's say their stated reason was they didn't like some tariff, or they decided they didn't want to pay taxes anymore, for example. Now, do you honestly believe, and be honest, like be intellectually honest with yourself, be rational, do you honestly believe the U.S. government would turn around and say, oh, well, if you don't want to pay your taxes, I can see, I can see that, so go ahead and leave.
Kind of, honestly, I'll say about 50-50. The reason why the thing that I base that 50-50 off of are our shoot, I forgot the exact name of it. What do they call
but they're not states.
Guam and Puerto Rico? Shoot. Okay, I'll just say okay, the reason why I say that is because there has been no rush to get these. I can't think of the name of it right now off the top of my head. Rush to be states or anything like that.
States are a bit different than U.S.
The fact that we're paying them, and
the Constitution is clear on the fact that the clear difference between a state and a territory. I mean, they're not even really comparable.
Yes, but the reason why I bring that up is because you're talking about tariffs and taxes and stuff like that. And would another state, would we allow a state to secede? Well, when I look at the financial burden of Puerto Rico and stuff like that, there is still the financial burden is not playing into effect at all on whether or not we hurry up and set them as a state or anything like that. The financial like burden of this is not being considered. So it's possible to rationally think that a state would be able to secede for another reason. Like I said, I use California, and
I have to stop you there again too, because Puerto Rico
wouldn't be
is
taken
not in
into
fact
effect.
a state, and states aren't allowed to leave the union for any reason.
I think
is there any way I could go back to the California and Texas?
Okay, so I'll
because you brought that up, and,
like
I wanted to address that. So we need to distinguish between a minority of the population in a state advocating secession and the actual state the actual state seceding, because there's quite a substantial difference between the two. So it's not surprising to me that Trump is not threatening war with California or Texas, because it's not a credible threat. They're not actually going to secede. Yeah.
Was that it? Oh, okay.
Oh no, I mean,
right.
yeah,
like it was gonna be a little bit
they're not actually seceding. Yeah, there are some people within these states talking about secession, but people talk about all kinds of crazy shit. The moment that it would become like a serious possibility of war is if secession was actually a serious thing.
Well, okay. in my opinion, and it's kind of weird because if I was trying to be in like say I'm going completely just off of the topic for the debate, which is the American Civil War was primarily about secession rather than slavery, then it's yes, the Civil War, the American Civil War was primarily about slavery more than secession, especially when you read the document. Now, if you want to have a debate on whether there could have been any other reasons, whether the country would have went to the Civil War for any other reason other than slavery, that's kind of a different debate. But I can talk about that also. Now, I think when it comes to stuff like that, yes, there was with the other states, with the southern states leaving, and I do believe that it would cause a financial burden with the amount of states that was leaving. But it all ties right back into slavery once again, because the financial burden that the North would have felt if the South would have left would have been because of the plantations and everything else, all the finances still down south of the cash crops of cotton and stuff like that. So yeah, so even if it was just about financial reasons, the financial reasons are still kind of tied right back into slavery whatsoever. At least so if I try to come up with another reason, it's like I said, it is hard to say. It is, and I'm not even trying to like mess with you on this. I really think it's hard to say whether or not the country would have went to war for any other reason
there's
other
a few
than
reasons
slavery.
why we might suspect
based
that
on
the
just
U.S.
secession.
government would not allow states to secede. I mean, well, there's a lot of reasons why that would probably be the most rational position. But briefly, I could talk about Lincoln's stated reason, where he very, very clearly said that this wasn't about slavery; it was about preserving the Union. Now, we might can debate about whether he was being honest about that or whatnot, but it is a fact that he stated clearly. He said that if he could not free a single slave and preserve the Union, he would.
Yep, and I do believe that, and yes, but once again, I keep bringing it back to slavery just because I want to harp on that right there. Just that even he said even if he couldn't free a single slave, but it was still the first reason, still the primary reason was slavery. And so to go to your point, going off your statement, then yes, probably if there would have been another reason for the secession, any reason for the secession, then it is perfectly plausible that the U.S. still would have went to war. Well, the North still would have went to war with the South.
Okay. So, well, then we can go to other historical examples
agree
too.
with you
like,
on that.
I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but have you ever heard of the nullification crisis? Okay, so I just know like a little bit about this because I went to a middle school in South Carolina for 1 year once. I'm from Hawaii, but I just happened to, my mom had moved out there. And so I learned a little bit about South Carolina history. And so like way back in the days under President Jackson, South Carolina was at it again, same shit basically. They produced this tariff which South Carolina called the Tariff of Abominations. And basically what happened is it was protecting northern industries at the expense of southern states like South Carolina. And so what happened is the South Carolina legislature simply nullified the federal law. They said, nope, we're not paying the tariff. You can't make laws here in our state. You don't have the authority. President Jackson's response to that was, of course, okay, we're going to invade South Carolina now. The only reason this was even averted in the first place, well, at the time, you have to remember Jackson's vice president was John C. Calhoun, who's a very famous senator from South Carolina. And Jackson said, like at the end of his career, he said his only regret as president was not shooting John C. Calhoun. So what happened is Congress basically more or less repealed the tariff, or they reduced it down to an amount that South Carolina was like, okay, fine, you know, we'll not go to war over like a 4% tariff or whatever they reduced it down to. So we have a clear-cut example from history where South Carolina was in fact ready to go to war over something that was not slavery. In this case, it was a tariff. And also, the U.S. government was ready to go to war over this issue in order to enforce the law. And this stems from like a much deeper issue. When the Constitution was originally written, it was actually a quite common view that states were allowed to secede from the Union. And this question was never fully answered. And the only real way to answer these kinds of questions are through a war. Only a war can decide whether any kind of question of sovereignty. If there's ever a question of sovereignty, it's only can be resolved by war, especially at that time when, you know, they didn't really have other options. It was either war or allow them to secede.
Well, let me say this, and I'm gonna. There's honestly, I think current day, that if there was, I think more likely if a state was to try to secede now, that it would probably. I don't think there would be another civil war and that's going off of the current environment, the current political environment and stuff like that. When people say civil war and stuff like that, but as far as the North assembling an army and the South assembling an army and them going to war with each other in this day and age, I don't think for whatever reason that it's possible now. And that's because of the amount of families that live in the North and the South, the weapons, and just the media and everything else. And I reference Katrina. Now, you remember when Hurricane Katrina and everything was going crazy down here in New Orleans and stuff like that? Well, they sent in active duty, like from Fort Bragg and Fort Hood and stuff like that, to the police up that. And I was stationed at Fort Hood at the time, and there was no reason that we could have, even if somebody was shooting somebody else, there was no reason to justify like an American shooting an American soldier shooting like anybody else, American on American, like as far as wars, that is a little taboo now. That's what I'm saying. I don't think in this current day and age, I think there'd be some kind of trade restrictions and stuff like that, and probably trying to like block anything from going in that state. But as far as an actual war, or civil war,
I don't think
that's
it
even
would
feasible
be
in the current day and
similar
age.
to the U.S. Civil War in that there would be a large group of states seceding. What I'm saying is that if any state, any of the 50 states decided for whatever reason that they wanted to not be, let's say they didn't agree with our foreign policy in the Middle East, for example, and they decided, you know what, we're not going to finance this anymore. We're going to let California is just going to secede from the United States. I feel quite, you know, I'll go ahead and assert, because I think it's perfectly reasonable to assume that the U.S. government would, in fact, use the military or any means necessary, for that matter, to prevent this from happening. It's simply not in the U.S. government's interest to allow any state to secede for any reason.
I do understand what you're saying, but I understand exactly what you're saying, but it's like, what? Let's since we're working in hypotheticals right now, we have about 23 minutes left. Let's give California right now. So California decides to secede right now from the union.
I'd say it would probably lead to
let's talk about what options that Trump would have. He could
California.
In
An interim
California or
government,
the
a
U.S.
provisional
presidency?
government would probably be set up. The most of the legislature or whoever was mostly responsible would probably be tried for treason. I guess, I don't know.
I don't, just because of optics and how it would look, I don't think I can see treason, but I couldn't see like the death penalty because
They'd go to
I
prison.
think with the current way
They wouldn't
the
execute him
media
for
works
sure,
and
but
stuff
I
like
mean,
that, and the
people
amount of
would go to
sympathy and
prison.
stuff like that.
I mean, right now the U.S. government has the power to detain anyone for any reason without habeas corpus.
Yeah.
You know, Trump could justify it based on terrorism if he wanted to.
I think that's a little bit of a reach. I really, well, it's like this is what I think, and this is just my personal opinion. I believe that it would stop at blocking imports and exports. I think if California, say tomorrow, California seceded and they said we are no longer in the union, I see them like the same thing with sanctuary states. You see with the sanctuary, I'm sorry, the sanctuary cities and the sanctuary states. Right now, with the sanctuary cities and the sanctuary states, right now, all the federal government can do is cut off federal funding to those states. And it's not too far to travel from being a sanctuary state to seceding from the union. It's actually not that far. It's really not that far. So I think if California was to secede right now, I think the country would cut off federal funding to California, and I think it would honestly stop right there. And that's as far as it would go, because no president is going to authorize military force to go roll into California and start shooting citizens, because once you do that, there's basically no bringing that state back into the fold at all. That could only happen that one time back then at the Civil War. That is probably the only time that could have happened back then. But in this current day and age,
okay, so I agree that
it's
war would of course be the last thing that would happen. It would be the last option. You know, they would try a million things before that. You know, there would be a hell of a lot of PR and propaganda, and you know, trying to influence legislatures to vote not for secession. I'm saying if it ever did come to that point and the legislature actually introduced articles of secession and, you know, try to create their own nation, you can imagine what would happen. I mean, we have military and naval bases in California. What, are they just going to leave? Probably not. So in order to have a war, you actually have to have a resistance, right? There would have to be people in California willing to go to war over this issue. They would have, because the U.S. government is, if they have to. The U.S. government, of course, does not prefer that as a first option. But if, you know, in order to achieve its goals, that is one of the options the U.S. government has, is to actually do it by force. So in the case of California, the only way there wouldn't be a war is if they decided they were not willing to go to war over the issue. Because from the government side, if there's any kind of army, in America, which a U.S. government considers California to be a part of America, regardless of what California thinks. So any kind of foreign army that exists in California simply would not be allowed to exist under any circumstances. I've heard of it. I've never watched it.
Designated
Is that the
Survivor?
Jack Bauer one, right?
So the Kiefer Sutherland, yeah. So in the show Designated Survivor, it kind of the same thing kind of happens. Well, a bomb blows up Congress and the president and everything else. The Designated Survivor, Kiefer Sutherland takes over. Well, I think it was Minnesota or Michigan decided to secede from it. And and I know that's a TV show, so I'm not claiming that that's reality, but I see it like the governor of Minnesota, he militarized his National Guard and they secured the airports and stuff like that. And I think going back to California, I don't know the size of California's National Guard, but I'll just assume that it's big because it's California size. You're right. I think it would be really, really hard to militarize the National Guard of California because you have opinions. You'd have to have basically like, yeah, exactly. You'd have to have a majority of California, which honestly, I think there's probably a lot of people that wish California would secede. But at the moment, the governor tried to militarize the National Guard, called them up. Due to the fact there's like Fort Irwin down there, so there's actual like federal military army bases there. It wouldn't. I really don't see it happening. And as far as the U.S. president, like I said, I really can't actually see a U.S. president declaring war on.
It probably wouldn't happen like that. It would probably happen more like the way it happened in South Carolina, whereas the government would simply move in more troops to South Carolina based on some kind of pretext. And at some point, if California really, really, really wanted to secede, they would have to get rid of these troops somehow. And that's basically what happened in South Carolina when they started firing on them from Fort Sumter. If you remember, it was South Carolina who fired the first shots. It was the students at the Citadel, because they really, really, really wanted to secede. They weren't just pretending. And in order for you to claim that you're your own country, for example, like if California decided, okay, now we're an independent country, okay, then why do you have 100,000 U.S. troops in your country? You know, they would have to do something about that in order to be independent.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. Going back to the Civil War, do you think that the amount of states that was seceding played into it? As in, you brought up the amount of states that seceded that kind of prompted Lincoln into going into the Civil War. So you think if it would have been just like one state, let's say a small state, let's say just South Carolina, do you think if it would have only have been South Carolina that seceded?
Yes, because the U.S. government's position at that time was very clear. Lincoln was absolutely crystal clear on the fact that states are not allowed to secede. Before him, Andrew Jackson was very clear. The U.S. government's position has actually never changed on this issue. States are simply not allowed to secede for any reason. It's totally out of the question. Once you're in, you're just in.
I just wanted.
Then it would have just been easier. Then they would just have to fight South Carolina. It would have been over real quick.
Because I think going. Yeah, but it still would have been the domino effect as far as I see. If it would have just been one state, like say South Carolina, I think other states like Georgia would have came to their rescue, would have just led back into the full-fledged Civil War anyway. But man, we drifted like completely far, but that's okay. That's okay though. I like
I agree with
open
you.
discussion debates. That's actually my favorite kind.
In this particular case, this was the stated reason for secession. Nobody can reasonably dispute the fact that they wanted to secede because, you know, they wanted to keep slaves, obviously. But I'm just saying that it really doesn't matter why they wanted to secede, because the U.S. government position is not changing no matter what your stated reason is. You know, you could have a perfectly valid and good reason for leaving the United States, and even then, the U.S. government will not accept that reason. And especially not back then.
Yeah. I'm trying to find some
Because
flaws
I deal
in that
with
sentence you just said,
the
just to play
like
devil's
there's like a
advocate.
Hawaiian kingdom movement here in Hawaii, and they're talking about secession and things like that. But like to get past all the nonsense, I say, okay, like let's assume every single one of your arguments were correct. What happens when America just tells you to go fuck yourself? I mean, do you have a response to that? Like they don't. Like first of all, we have to understand that the U.S. government is a self-interested institution. The U.S. government's going to do what is in the interest of the U.S. government, unless it becomes the case that allowing states to secede is somehow in the U.S. government's interest. That position will likely never change. Because the U.S. government doesn't care actually about the ideals that we espouse, freedom, whatever. What comes first is actually the U.S. government. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of the U.S. government takes precedence over everything, any kind of international law. Like our government's not like a nice, reasonable person.
Yeah, I agree with that.
They will
I agree with that.
do bad things if it's in their interest.
Yeah, but I'll actually throw something in there too. A lot of it, I think, a lot of it has to do also with the president too, who the president is at the time of that this secession would happen.
I don't think Obama would allow anyone to secede. For
maybe
sure.
if you go all the way back to Reagan. No, that's what. No, that's. Oh, I don't know. And I thought, and I just went back in my mind, and I think probably Reagan, and I went through all of them. And maybe I just don't think a lot of the last 5 or so presidents, but I think you'd have to go back to Reagan, kind of, in my opinion, to actually find a president that will be willing to, say, mobilize the military in the other, say, 49 states to kind of blockade the state that was trying to secede from the Union. Like, if I say, if I start right now with Trump, no. Obama.
Let me put it this way. Like when I said regime change, I'm saying that if any governor from any state nationalized their National Guard for this explicit stated reason of revolution or society, whatever you want to call it, it all means the same thing. Leaving America, starting your own country. If any government did that, or any governor did that, they would quickly be removed from office. This could happen in many ways. You could use the SWAT team. I mean, there's a million ways that this person would, in fact, be removed from power. And he would be, a friendly government would be installed there. And so, yeah, we probably would avoid war in that way. The only way it would actually come to war is if the governor put up some kind of resistance. Now, if he had the National Guard come to the governor's mansion and he put 5,000 troops there, like defending the governor from any kind of response from the federal government, then it could hypothetically lead to war. I imagine the U.S. government or the U.S. military would notify all the soldiers there that they are in violation of UCMJ and things like that, and they need to stand down, or else the tanks are going to start rolling in.
Yeah, I actually agree with you 100%. And I was just thinking about this while you were talking. Yeah, in order to do that now with a governor kind of becoming a dictator or whatever, or a president, if he wants to call himself president of his state, the whole thing would have to be done in secret. Because at the point where that talk started, a responsible president would, one, probably summon that governor to DC, or fly down to that state himself to go kind of nip this in the bud or something like that. So, yeah, I'll say that. I don't think. Yeah, I think it'll be stopped long before it got to the point of militarizing anybody or anything like that. Because there's no way you could start that and get to the point of seceding from the Union without like the media covering that and word getting out and this lady calling her congressman or something.
Yeah, I think it would be a simple matter of them issuing. They would issue an arrest warrant, a federal arrest warrant for the governor. I think it would be a simple matter of them issuing a federal arrest warrant for the governor.
You still got me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think U.S. Marshals would simply arrest the governor if that ever happened. But I think we basically agree on the main points here. We agree that the racist slave-owning South wanted to secede in order to keep their slaves. There's no real disputing that fact. But I think it's also established that the U.S. government would not, especially then, just based on what we can gather from historical documents, what the presidents have said throughout history, and what the official government position has always been, which is that states may not leave for any reason. And so the question of secession is the main thing here. Like, that is the cause of the war. If it were, in fact, slavery, people such as Lysander Spooner suggested, why don't we simply buy every single slave? Because even if you bought every single slave at even like 5 times the market value, plus you gave them all 40 acres and a mule, if you did all of that, it would still be an order of magnitude cheaper than the Civil War was. But that wouldn't solve the question of secession. All that would do is solve the question of slavery. Now, let's say there's no more slaves, but South Carolina, they find some other shit they don't like, some tariff, some tax, some bullshit, right? No matter what the reason is, if they decide they're going to secede for that reason, you can bet your ass there would have been a war.
Yes. So, and I see your verbal judo that you're doing right there, which is pretty good, which is awesome. But no, and I understand what you're saying, but it still goes to the fact of I don't know if I use my analogy of my bank robber yet, but okay, so a guy goes into a bank and robs the bank, then he gets arrested, and then he goes to jail. Now, the reason why he went to jail, you can't say the reason why he went to jail is because he got arrested. No, you have to go prior to the got arrested to he robbed the bank. So yes, the Civil War happened because of secession, but the reason for the secession was slavery. So slavery is still the heart. Slavery is still the root. And like I said, we can talk about what other reasons there would have been, but we have nothing to base that off of except for just a hypothesis. It's never happened again. It's only happened once.
We do have something.
That was because of slavery.
We do have the statements by President Lincoln, for example, and President Jackson. So we have a pretty clear understanding of what the U.S. government position is on secession in general. And so I think that by showing that secession is simply not okay, period, and the only way we really know that is because of the result of the Civil War. Because if the Civil War never happened, that may still be an open question. It may have come up at some other point. Some other state may have decided they just wanted to be their own country for whatever reason. And I feel confident in asserting that the U.S. government simply would not allow that to happen under any circumstances, mostly because it's simply not in their interest, and they're a self-interested institution. But I wanted to thank you, Terrence. I'm going to give you the last word. Go ahead. 20 seconds. Is that not right?
Okay, and 3 minutes. I could tap dance for 3 minutes, but let me say this, and I'm gonna. mine says 3 minutes. Is mine completely wrong? But I was going to say, hey, I'm just going to reference like sanctuary cities and sanctuary states and see that right now you have something that's going on where states decide they're not going to follow federal government guidelines. And the only thing that's happened is just we're going to cut off federal funding, which